All right, welcome again to our IRIS NRC Book Club event. My name is Bill Dickman. I'll be moderating the event today. I'd like to just say a little bit about our sponsor here, which is the Institute for Regional and International Studies, the National Resource Center. IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. Thank you to our co-sponsors for the event today, which is the Mead-Witter School of Music and the Department of Geography at UW-Madison. We invite you to visit their websites and follow them on social media. Essie Lechner will be running tech support. Lenchner will be running tech support. If you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link, a post-event email. You will only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place the nation has called Tijop, or Dejop, since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed, with both the federal and the state government repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Okay. I forgot to introduce myself. I did say a little bit, I'm Bill Dickman. I'm a guitarist and teacher here in Madison. I actually did study at UW-Madison briefly with Javier Calderon. And I've studied at Arizona State and in Montana too, so out west. I have a couple of guitars here, so I'm interested in guitar, acoustic guitars and where the wood comes from. We're going to talk a lot about that stuff today. So Chris Gibson here is our author who will be speaking, and a little bit about him. In the 1990s, Chris kicked around as a musician, a swing dancer, and a record store tragic, as he put it, before setting into a career as a professor of geography at the University of Wollongong, Australia. In an effort to combine a musical background with a proper academic job, he wrote a PhD on the geography of the music industry, tracing links between urban and regional scenes and globalization. With his supervisor, John Connell, he turned much of the PhD into his first book, Soundtracks. Since then, Chris and John have written books on music, tourism, and festivals. With Andrew Warren, he wrote a history of surfboard making and a book tracing guitars from factory to forest, which is the one we'll be examining today. His most recent book is The Church's Starfish for Bloomsbury 33 1/3 series, which I plan on listening to that album after this session today. It's piqued my interest about the band of The Church. Okay, Chris, I think I'm going to hand it over to you if you're set to go.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you for the introduction. And it's really encouraging to hear that in your corner of the world that you also acknowledge the native inhabitants and custodians of land. That's very much something that we do in Australia as well. We acknowledge Aboriginal country and the traditional owners and elders are past, present, and emerging. So I'd like to also acknowledge the Ho-Chunk Nation. I'm actually here in LA at the moment en route to Wisconsin. I'll be within proximity of all of you tomorrow evening. I'm just not quite there yet, which is why we're on a Zoom. But where I work in Sydney, Australia, I work and live on what is Gadigal country, on Gadigal lands, which is unceded. There's never been a treaty presiding over that land, so it's still and very much is Aboriginal land. A huge thank you before we begin to Stephen for the introduction and the invitation to do this, to Bill for introducing this and for agreeing to chair the session, and for Essie for technical assistance. I've never really done anything like this book club format with a question and answer. The book that we're going to talk about today about guitars, we have done quite a few public events around, but never in a book club format. So I'm really fascinated to sort of see how things unfurl, how the conversation unfolds over the next little while. I am not going to bore you with PowerPoint slides. I thought that instead I'd just say a few things off the cuff about the book and where it began and where it came from, and hopefully not go on for too long because I think it's a book club. So I guess part of the format here is really for us to have a conversation about the book rather than for me to lecture you about it. Where did it all begin? Well, in the pages of the book itself, actually, the book opens with a story about where the idea of doing this research and writing this book came from. Actually, before we even get to that, a small little bit of interactive question and answer from me, actually, of the audience. Before I begin, I'd like to know, and I think the chat may be the way to do this. It would be interesting to know how many of you are guitar players, and it's okay if you're not, but it would be nice to know if any of you are guitar players. So you could either do the thumbs up signal or perhaps put something in the chat if you are a guitar player. Even if it's just you don't have to be like proficient or anything. I can quickly start talking about very guitar-y things and that some of that terminology, the woods in guitars and the parts of guitars can be something that can get quite technical, and I don't want to alienate anybody. So I'm just interested to see how many people are guitar players. So perhaps some, but certainly not all, it seems, are guitar players. So that's really useful. Thank you. And we've got some beginner players, people who've strummed a couple of chords, perhaps, that sort of thing. All right, wonderful. Okay, so that's fantastic. Thank you for that, sharing that. I appreciate that because it means I will try not to get too bogged down in the technicalities of the design of the guitar and production processes and all those sorts of things, because I am very much a guitar nerd and we can get into that stuff if we want to, but I think that would be probably a bit alienating. So I'll keep things a bit more broad than that. Okay, so in the first pages of the book, it tells you a little story about where this project came from. As Bill talked about in the introduction, I have a background as a musician and in all sorts of different ways that is manifest throughout my life and my working career. I wrote about music, but from a geography perspective earlier in my academic career. So I guess I've always had this interest, a scholarly interest in music, as well as playing in bands myself. I play guitar. I also play lap steel guitar as well in a couple of different bands. So I have a long history in a couple of different sort of styles of guitar playing. I'm less an acoustic and classical player, although my mum forced me to go through about 2 years worth of classical guitar lessons as a teenager. She said I wasn't allowed to have an electric guitar until I was at least proficient in classical guitar. So I had to get all the correct hand positions on the classical guitar and get all that technique down pat before she would let me come home with an electric guitar. But so I've got a guitar playing background myself. And then I'd say it would be 15 years ago. I joined a research group where we were doing a lot of research on sustainability issues in different forms and combinations. And we were also interested in things like the changing nature of work, how contemporary resource use is changing around the intensification of the production of things in our lives. So everything from tables to computers to surfboards, which was a book that I ended up writing with Andrew Warren, who was a PhD student of mine at the time. We were interested in the materials that stuff is made from and the stuff in our everyday lives. Like, where does it come from? What's the environmental impact of the production of the stuff, the material stuff in our lives? So I was involved in a couple of big projects like that. And there was always this thing in the back of my mind about guitars, and that guitars must have their own story to tell, really, about how they're made, the people that make them, and the woods and other materials that guitars are made from. So Andrew Warren, my co-author, and I were, as I mentioned, we had written a book coming out of his PhD on surfboard making around the world. And surfboard making had gone through all this series of transitions. It had become a mass manufacturing industry, whereas it used to be very much a craft-based industry. And there were these Hawaiian traditions of board making using wood, which were still practiced by Hawaiian elders that we had met and interviewed and spent time with for the book about surfboard making that we had put together. And we were actually in Hawaii for the launch of that book about surfboards and surfboard making. And one of the elders who ceremonially blesses trees, koa, a type of tree called koa, or acacia koa, as well as others, and ceremonially blesses those trees before felling them to make them into surfboards, took us on a trip to try and find some of those original trees. And it proved to be a real struggle. There were very few of the original forests that have remained on the slopes of the volcanoes, the Hawaiian volcanoes. Those trees grow at only a very particular band of elevation where the clouds tend to gather around the volcanoes. And a lot of those forests have been lost to ranching in particular, and pastoral development, but also to logging as well. So it was a kind of a sort of sad and poignant little moment there as we just launched this book about surfboards, and a key elder took us on this trip to try and find these woods. And then we just got talking to this particular elder, his name was Tom, about the trees and about those particular woods, because it turns out that those woods are also being used, or had traditionally been used, in musical instrument making, and in particular in guitars and ukuleles as well. And we just sort of realized then, I think, Andrew and I, that this was going to be our next project, and this would be the next book that we would write. It would be about guitars and how this, object, this thing in our life, an instrument, a material thing in our everyday lives, is connected to these bigger issues around resource use and production and the environmental burden of the world in which we live, and the stuff that we consume and that we use and we enjoy in our everyday lives. So we kind of basically started there. Our original aims were nowhere near as ambitious as the book then ended up being. So we learned a little bit from Tom about native Hawaiian timbers and wood. We then returned back to Australia, and we knew that there were a couple of really interesting Australian guitar companies that had been forging ahead in using Australian native timbers as a more sustainable alternative to some of the tropical timbers like rosewood and ebony that are increasingly embroiled in conflict and controversy around illegal logging and sort of over exploitation, basically. So we basically started by visiting a local guitar store and talking to it's actually, sadly, it's closed down since then, but a fantastic guitar store in Sydney, and talked to the owner, who gave us some contacts with the Australian manufacturers. So we visited some factories in Australia first, and took it from there. And we didn't really anticipate fully how big a project it would eventually become. We applied for research funding for this project very early on, and we did not get funded because no one is going to fund a couple of economic geographers to go tracing around the world in search of guitars. It was a hard sell to the funding body. So we had to kind of do it on the smell of an oily rag, and it became a bit more of a kind of labor of love project, I guess, that eventually took us 6 years to put together. And what we tended to do is to go to a factory and just ask really simple questions like, tell us a bit about how guitars are made. Could you show us around your factory? We'd love to talk to the workers and hear about the things that they do to make guitars. And almost always in these early sort of factory visits, in visiting guitar factories, we'd end up in the woodshed. We'd end up in a very particular part of guitar factories where they store and manage the woods. And it's like a library. They're often climate controlled. The actual factory spaces are often like chaotic. They're noisy. There's staff moving around. There's unfinished guitars that are moving around the factory. There's like metal music blaring out of workstations. They have this character to them, guitar factories. And if you ever get the chance to visit one, I highly recommend you do it. But they're really lively workspaces. And then at the sort of the end of the visit, you get taken into the woodshed or the wood store, And it's, yeah, I think library is the only way I can sort of describe it. But anyway, you get different characters. There's different people employed by guitar companies who look after the wood, who's procure the wood for guitar making, who look after these spaces. And it's like you've suddenly like left a kind of party factory and you're now in like a cross between a library and a science lab. And they're very quietly spoken people who are very precise with their words, and the woods are always really carefully stored, often climate and humidity controlled environments and those sorts of things. And then when we get into those spaces and talk to those workers, we'd say, well, just tell us about the wood. Where did it come from? And that's when we realized it was a much bigger task than we first thought, because of course the woods that go into the average guitar come from all around the world. And so Bill has a guitar in his room there. So if Bill shows us this guitar, this is a Martin guitar. Did you say it was a D35? I think it's a very nice. So it's got the three-piece back. You can see there, it's got three pieces of wood to make up. I'm already getting into guitar terminology here. That we just talked off air prior to the beginning of this. That guitar is around about 2017.
It's about 2017. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, three-piece back, about 2017, HD 35, in fact.
HD 35. We were in the Martin Guitar Factory in 2017, so I may have seen your guitar being put together.
I did, since this will play right into everything you're talking about, I have had a hard time actually placing the serial number with when it was made. Yeah, so there's been a little ambiguity even with this guitar when I'm trying to trace it back just to when it was made. But
interesting. Yeah, okay. There's a bit of an art form, a bit of an art to figuring out serial numbers and so forth. Interesting. Well, that guitar. So it turns out that guitar, like to follow those woods back to the source, that will have a Sitka spruce top that's come from the Pacific Northwest or from Alaska. And it has Indian rosewood backs and sides. And the three pieces you can see on the back, that design was invented by Martin so that they could use smaller pieces of wood rather than have broader, wider pieces of wood on the back, which meant that they could use the wood more efficiently and they could rely on, you didn't rely quite so much on really, really old growth trees. The way you cut a tree into guitar parts is that you cut perpendicular to the grain. So you imagine a big fat tree and you're cutting perpendicular in towards the core. Those wide boards are what then end up on the front and on the back of your guitars. So they have to be quite wide trees in order to be able to cut pieces of wood that size, which means that inevitably guitar making is connected to old growth forestry, the logging of very old trees. So that's part of the reason why we discovered that guitar making has these connections through to quite controversial issues around forests and how they're managed, how these resources are being managed. So it's just an interesting little aside, a little technical nerdy thing, but Bill's fabulous guitar there has a little story on the back there about an adaptation that Martin came up with to try and reduce its dependence on the really old wood and to be able to more efficiently use smaller pieces of wood when that wood itself became more scarce. So the wood on the backs and sides of Bill's guitar there come from India. They now use Indian rosewood. It's a type of wood called rosewood. I can't quite see the fretboard. It's probably a rosewood fretboard.
It's like it.
Yep, it's a rosewood fretboard. So already just in one guitar there, you've got woods coming from really different corners of the world. And in that same factory, you'll have other models of guitar that are made from mahogany that's come from Honduras or other parts of Central America. There may well be ebony, which comes from equatorial Africa, and particularly from a country called Cameroon. And there are actually Australian native timbers that are also being made into guitars here in the United States as well. So the world comes together in the design of guitars. And that's what we discovered in our asking questions in the woodsheds of factories about where these timbers came from. So it meant basically that this was a much bigger journey than we thought it was going to be. And we basically saved up our pennies, bought bus tickets and plane tickets where we could. We piggybacked on traveling overseas for conferences and that sort of thing, trying to find factories or suppliers of wood and those sorts of things near where we would be at a particular conference, for example, to try and slowly but gradually, like jigsaw puzzle pieces, really find information, fill out the story, and then start to put it together into the book. So we ended up going to various parts of the United States and Canada, to Brazil, across Europe, to China and to Japan, various parts of Australia. So we went pretty widely and quite globally in search of the factories, and then from there, the sawmills that supply those factories with wood. And from the sawmills, eventually, our goal was to try and find and witness the trees. So we wanted to learn ultimately, and actually be there in the forests and see trees that might one day become guitars. So that was the goal, really, is to try and trace it all the way back to those forest origins. There were quite a few surprises along the way. One of the things that I learnt along the way was a lot about those trees. So I was not a forestry student. I wasn't an arborist. And for me, one of the really lovely surprises was spending time with both Indigenous custodians of forests and with commercial foresters, people who log trees for a living, as well as conservationists, to learn about those forests and about those trees. My kids often accompanied us on some of these trips because we'd often take side trips off of holidays to try and visit a forest. Again, saving money. We didn't have a research grant, just sort of winging this. And my kids were smaller at the time, and they'd often sort of tease me that they were about to get a lecture about a spruce tree, or a bunya pine tree, or a maple tree, or whatever it was at the time. But it was fantastic, and it meant that we got to spend time in those forests and just even learning how to actually spot those trees and to be able to estimate how old they are, and to learn a little bit about the cultural uses of those forests from Indigenous groups, as well as some of the kind of real pressures on those forests in the contemporary era. That was definitely a surprise, I think, for me. I didn't really know that I was going to end up being someone who was concerned about forests or write about forests necessarily. I would say that the whole project, in a way, was a surprise. Like, it was I often say sometimes a really good book that you want and ended up writing, or a research project that you end up researching, they often find you. You don't necessarily strategize them like years in advance. And this was one of those where it was just one thing led to another, and we found ourselves on, walking the logs of the Fraser River in Vancouver, or in a forest, an hour inland from Rio de Janeiro, like learning about rosewood recuperation strategies. And so the unexpected places, I guess, that we ended up was something that I will remember for the rest of my life from doing this project. I'd say the other kind of key surprise, and a bit of a takeaway, I think, actually, from the whole project, is that we were continually challenged in our preconceptions as we went to do this field work. So I think had we visited the factories, and had we stopped when we got a picture, we kind of drew a map basically of where guitar woods had come from. And you could then go and look at the scientific literature, the forestry management literature, the conservation literature. You can pretty much piece together a story about Sitka spruce and the Pacific Northwest forests and the conflicts and controversies around that. You can put a picture together about what happened in Brazil in its industrial period, and why all those Atlantic forests were lost where rosewood originally grew. So you can put that story together without necessarily going to those places. And once you've figured out those supply chains and where things operate. And the story is, like, it's kind of sad and depressing, but predictable, that it's a classic case of human overexploitation of those resources. So in almost every one of those cases, you have this history, a kind of a sequence of events where you have colonialism, you have a kind of rapacious, uncontrolled exploitation of those forests, widespread clearing and logging, the establishment of pastoralism, and then industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. We could have sort of stopped at that point in the story, and it could have been a book that was about exposing the environmental tragedies, the history of colonialism and capitalism and its impact on the earth, as told through the guitar. There is a kind of dash of that in the book, I think, although I'd be interested to hear your views, those of you who've had a chance to read it. There is very much that story echoing through the book, because it's undeniable that that is part of the story of guitars. But I think perhaps the biggest surprise for us was actually then witnessing those forests, visiting those communities who've traditionally relied on timber mills, on sawmilling, on logging for their livelihoods, and talking to people, both historically and in the contemporary period, who make a living out of guitars and supplying guitar woods to the global industry. We came to kind of challenge our preconceptions. And so often the people who actually care most for those forests and for their futures are the very people whose livelihoods depend upon them. And it makes sense when you think about it that way, right? Their livelihoods depend on a sustainable, ongoing forest product industry. So they're not anti-green, and they often describe themselves in sort of contradictory ways as suppliers of the guitar industry who are kind of like greenie loggers, for example. So we met a lot of the characters, and we came to realize that they're people who grapple with their contradictions, and that are also actually in lots of unknown ways, sort of hidden ways, are actually doing really important things for the future of the industry. So a couple of the key kind of characters that you meet in the book along the way, some of the sawmillers are themselves, for example, replanting forests themselves on pastoral land. So they're actually either partnering with pastoralists, they're partnering with guitar firms to buy cattle ranches and farms with the intent of then replanting those and returning those back to be forests for the guitar makers and players of the future. And part of the reason that they're doing this is because of a structural condition that they find themselves in, where the global forestry industry is basically not looking after the guitar manufacturers and guitar players. Those woods that we talked about, like those in Bill's guitar, they're not mass plantation forest species. So if you've ever witnessed or been near a plantation forest, and you see lots and lots of uniform, like the landscape is full of the same trees to the horizon kind of thing. Those species are chosen to grow quickly and to provide the clearest wood between branches where you have knots. And that gives you the greatest return on your investment as a plantation forester. Well, those species are things like Douglas fir, for example, that grows really quickly. You can harvest it, you can chop it down in a 30-year cycle, 50-year cycle perhaps, and you can get your return on your investment. Those same plantations, they're not growing things like the Sitka spruce, the rosewoods, those timbers that would be made into guitars, because they grow too slow and they need to be much bigger, as I talked about before. They need to be these big wide trees in order to be made into guitars. So the contemporary big mass, industrial scale forestry system that the world is very much now becoming standardized around is around a very small number of species of timber, of wood, of trees that are not guitar trees and not guitar timbers. So we've kind of gone past a point, I think, with the guitar industry, where the industry itself knows that it can't survive depending on the same timbers forever. It either has to turn to using alternative timbers and different kinds of materials, or they are actually having to do things now to try and shore up that resource supply for the future. And so we learn a lot more about what's going on beneath the surface and behind the scenes among people who are in the industry, who you might think of as perhaps the baddies in the story, but they're actually not. It's more complicated than that, actually. And so even within this kind of like exploitative core of a production industry that relies on nature, has to fell trees in order to make things, the guitars that we use, there's also a source of hope there, and that there are these particular individuals, these workers in guitar companies and in sawmills, who are taking it upon themselves to do that recuperative work, to do that restoring work, to do that sustainability work for the future of the industry. So that was a bit of a surprise for us, and I think a bit of a key take home from the book. I'll finish up, but the one thing I would say also for the guitar players here, and I don't know whether you get a sense of this from reading the book, but I hope you do. But as a takeaway, I think for guitar players, what we were hoping to, I think, instill in the reader who is a guitar aficionado or interested in guitars, someone who's interested in guitars, is really to just, I guess, know a little bit more about the wood that's used in guitar making and where it's come from, and to care for your guitars ultimately. There's only so many guitars that can be made in the world, and guitars ought not be another disposable product like running shoes or computers for that matter. So the guitars, if you like, that are in the world right now, that have been made and that are circulating, that are under your bed in a case, or that are on the shelves of a secondhand store, that total stock of guitars is the world's forests captured in them. And so we kind of owe it to ourselves and to the planet, I think, to care for those guitars. So get your guitars repaired, have them maintained, get them looked at by someone in your local guitar shop so that they play nicely. You can always have you can adjust things on a guitar to make it more playable, to keep it in a really nice functioning state of play over time. And even the kind of like the cheap guitars of the past, if they're well looked after and they age well, guitars age beautifully, they become warmer over time, sound even better. Even those cheap guitars can actually become heirlooms of the future. So it's a bit of a kind of parable, I think, for us as humans about how we make things and how we look after things for the future. If we can invest a little bit of care in our guitars, we think there's a kind of a lesson in that for guitar players, but also for society more broadly. All right, that's as much as I wanted to say, and I've probably gone on slightly longer than you wanted, which I did warn could be the case. So I apologize for that. But that's probably enough from me. I'd be interested to hear if any of you have any questions.
Okay, looks like we do have some questions right away. So we've got, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not muted. So we got a question from Mike here, Mike Hasanoff. Was your research more about acoustic guitars than electric guitars? Just wondering about the timber needs for the different types, i.e. does electric guitar need a tree with a large diameter? Pardon me.
Great question, Mike. We looked at both electric and acoustic guitars for the book. The controversies surround the acoustic guitar more than electric guitars. And part of it is to do with the structural dimensions and needs of an acoustic guitar. Because an acoustic guitar it's like a box. Well, some people call it the sound box of the guitar. It's essentially thin slithers of material that are held together with braces and other sort of structural material on the inside of a guitar. An acoustic guitar is always liable to kind of to tear itself apart because you're putting a lot of string tension through that instrument, through that box. So it's more fragile than an electric guitar. An electric guitar is really a solid block of wood with the strings attached to it, so it can handle the string tension much better than an acoustic guitar. So because of that, there are a really limited number of species that can be used in acoustic guitar making, where you need to have this combination of woods that are both incredibly strong and also sound fantastic when they reverberate. So they have to have this vitreousness, this ability to reverberate crisply and make beautiful notes, but also not fall apart as a structural design. And so that's why spruce is used in a lot of acoustic guitar making, because spruce is pound for pound stronger than steel. Spruce was actually used in a lot of early airplane manufacture because it's both light and incredibly strong. It has this incredible grain structure to it. So if you look at the face of an acoustic guitar, you'll see these perfectly parallel, long, straight grains. It's like an engineering marvel, actually, a cut piece of spruce. So its ability to be able to hold itself together is something that's quite particular to that wood. And that's why it's ended up being used in acoustic guitars. But yeah, you need these really old spruce trees to give you the wide enough slices of wood to be able to make an acoustic guitar. Electric guitars, a little different. They tend to have solid blocks of timber. That gives you more availability of different woods to be able to use. You can also potentially put electric guitars together with smaller pieces of timber and glued in particular kinds of ways. So there's more scope for a wider range of responses to the scarcity issue in guitar timbers in electric guitar making. But having said that, we learned about some of the challenges that are affecting electric guitar timbers along the way as well. So American ash, ash trees are they've become really common on electric guitars because Leo Fender back in the 1950s designed a guitar called the Telecaster. And at the time, he went to basically furniture suppliers, wood mills that were supplying furniture makers. And he was looking for something that had the right kind of qualities to it, but was also cheap. And it was a type of ash called swamp ash. Now, swamp ash was the section of the tree that was actually below the water in the swamps in the south where it was being milled at the time. And the furniture makers didn't want it, but it actually proved to be really good for electric guitar making. It did make a nice sound. So the woods in electric guitars will still influence the sound, and Leo Fender discovered this swamp ash was good for that. Well, swamp ash was always quite a plentiful timber until about 10 years ago, I think it is, where there is a thing, it's a little critter, it's called the emerald ash borer from memory. And it's basically an insect that attacks ash trees, and it has spread across the United States and is taking out ash trees everywhere as it goes.
But we lost thousands on my property. The ash borer, I think, is called, or something like that.
The
But
ash borer, yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so there's now a crisis even in the electric guitar scene around ash because of that. So yeah, we're having to find alternatives to these woods all the time, even for electric guitars.
Okay, looks like there's another question here. Let's see. Maybe not.
There's a question from Claire.
Can you see it there? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, did any of the guitar manufacturers talk about how they might try to introduce or market new species of wood to customers as traditional woods become less available? Yes, is the short answer to that. That's very much where innovation is at in the industry now. So the key challenge is to find substitute timbers to the spruces and the rosewoods and the ebonies and those sorts of things. The I guess there's a couple of things to say about that, and that is that a substitute is never going to sound quite the same. So there is an Australian timber which we learnt about, and we went and visited the forests for the book. An Australian timber called bunya pine, Araucaria bidwillii is the Latin name. It's an indigenous tree, like an Aboriginal people in Australia, in a particular part of Australia, really deep connection to this tree. But it was also planted by industrial foresters back in the 1920s who were experimenting with Australian trees to see if they could make industrial plantations out of them. It ended up failing as an industrial tree species, but those trees in those experimental plantations from the 20s still survive. And one of the sawmillers who supplies the guitar industry has an exclusive access to take a really limited number of those trees per annum. And so bunya pine has become an alternative to Sitka spruce, and it has that same cellular structure that you see on Sitka spruce tops of guitars. But it doesn't sound quite the same. So it depends on the degree to which you want your guitar to sound like a D35, for example, like what Bill has. Like that has a very distinctive sound. So there's a challenge for the industry here around the traditional sound of a guitar and the traditional timbers and the degree to which consumers themselves are willing to embrace alternatives. And it varies a lot, to be honest, I would say. Some guitar manufacturers are more innovative, experimental, they're more adventurous with those alternatives, as are some guitar players and consumers. So I think we're going through a period of transition, and that transition is very much going to involve using substitutes and alternative species, and also a much wider and more diverse array of species where we can guarantee sustainable harvesting practices. Because the last thing we want to see is that the industry switches over to, let's say, Australia's bunya pine. There aren't enough bunya pine trees in Australia to make all the guitars that get made in the world. So we can't just replace one traditional timber with one new or alternative timber, because we'll quickly overexploit that too. So there's quite a bit of talk around, a kind of widening the palette of timbers that might be available. What we will end up with as a response to that is just a broader diversity of guitars, basically. So the guitars of the future might not sound like the iconic Gibson Les Pauls and, Martin D35s of the past, but they'll have their own character to them, and there'll be a wider diversity of sounds that are available to the player as a consequence of that. That's the hope anyway in the guitar industry.
Okay. Chris, do you see any more questions there? Because I didn't see that question. Essie, I don't know if there was.
No, Donna has put a suggestion in for a guitar maker who describes the wood used in the guitars, and there's a documentary as well. So he's a Wisconsin-based guitar maker. There you go. Interesting. Yeah, I think that's really important. And one of the things I would say, if you are a guitar player or you're interested in buying a guitar, is to just ask questions in your guitar shop about the woods that are used in it. A lot of the guitar makers now do this kind of thing. They'll actually talk about their timbers and where they come from. It's become a kind of a marketing thing to some extent, to rather than hide the origins of those woods that are used in a guitar, to actually acknowledge that and to talk about where they come from, particularly if they've got a better sustainability record around those. So the more that guitar makers like Bruce do that kind of thing, the better, in my view. Patricia has a question, Bill.
Yeah, I'm seeing it now. Yeah, would a layperson be able to detect a difference in the sound with various woods?
Yeah, good question. A really good question. I'm going to say probably to a limited extent. And so one of the things that's a bit of an issue for the industry actually is most of the guitars that get made and that get purchased are lower cost guitars. They're not like Bill's D35, which is a beautiful guitar. They're going to be at a lower price point. They're beginner guitars. And as a passionate music person myself, I believe that music has, it has this intangible contribution to make to culture and society. I think the more people that play musical instruments, the better. But that has an impact on the environment. If everyone's going to own a guitar or another musical instrument, those materials have got to come from somewhere. So one of the really big challenges is actually around mass manufacturing of lower cost instruments and what woods go into those. And so for most people, particularly as a beginner, it doesn't perhaps matter so much that it's authentic Sitka spruce or it's rosewood. What matters more for a beginner, and some of you have said that you're a beginner guitarist in the chat there. What matters more, I think, is playability. So when you purchase your first guitar, guitars can be very playable or they can be quite unplayable depending on the setup of the guitar, how far away from the fretboard the strings are, how big the guitar is, how long the fretboard is. All of those things can influence playability and your experience of that guitar as a beginner. So there's another conversation happening in the industry at the moment, which is around, well, to what extent do we actually need to be designing our mass-produced guitars with much more fungible woods, with woods that are much more plentiful and easy to procure in a more sustainable manner, and worry less about producing a kind of acoustically high-end instrument, but actually produce a very playable instrument for that beginner market. So that's another interesting transition happening in the industry at the moment. And there's another little footnote to this too, in that the statistics on players themselves and the demography of players is shifting. So back in the 1980s, when I bought my first electric guitar, once my mum would let me bring one home, which was a Fender Telecaster, a Japanese-made Fender Telecaster. You would walk into a guitar store and everybody working in the store would be a bloke, and all the people in the store playing guitars and buying guitars would be blokes. It'd be men, right? That demographic has shifted massively. So women overtook men as the buyers of guitars for the first time. It was 2019, I'm going to say. There are more women than men buying guitars. So hand in glove with this shift in the industry towards thinking more about the beginner's experience of a guitar that they buy. And we want them to learn to love that guitar, right? That's what you want as a passionate kind of advocate for music and for guitars. You want someone to love their guitar. We also need to be catering to a different kind of market. We need to be thinking about playability. There are physical differences in the sizes of guitars. So we're now seeing the average size of guitars shrink. And in part, that's to accommodate for a different demographic of guitar players themselves. And a smaller guitar is much more playable, particularly for a beginner. And for, for average female body size being that much smaller as well, it makes it, again, more accessible to play those smaller instruments. So it's a kind of an interesting little kind of, sub point, I suppose, to the sustainability transition that the industry is going through. It's going through a demographic transition as well.
Okay. Yeah, we got another question here from Lauren. Lauren says she loved the book, was particularly compelled by how it is a commodity chain analysis that incorporates the emotions and corporeality of the guitar. One of my questions, wondering if you all looked at about the quote unquote end of a lifespan for a guitar. For instance, what happens to the wood from ones that are smashed by rock and roll stars, etc.? Do they come back into circulation, go to landfills, go to something else?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lauren. Thank you. And thank you for the feedback on the book. There's a little bit right at the end of the book where we touch on this just slightly. My hope is that fewer and fewer guitars end up in landfill. But you see it, I don't know about in Wisconsin, but where I live in Sydney, you often see like cheap budget guitars that on the side of the street. They've been kind of thrown out, or they're being put on for what we call council cleanup. I don't know, there might be an equivalent phrase in your part of the world where you put out your old furniture and so forth, and it's picked up by council workers who take it back to either to be put into landfill or to be recycled. It's a really sad thing for me when I see that, even for what were originally cheap budget guitars. So my hope is that we actually shift our mindset there around the lifespan of guitars, and that even budget guitars should be looked after and cared for, because they can be on-sold, they can be things of value if they remain playable. It's that playability that's really the key. For a while there, this is not in the book, but one of the things that I did do throughout the years we were doing the research for this is I basically taught myself guitar repair off YouTube, because there's so many guitar repair aficionados and experts on YouTube now, and you can buy the specialist suppliers of all the guitar repair tools. And I went through a phase. I would just refuse to let a guitar sit on the side of the road, and I'd take it home, and it might be dinged or smashed up in one part, or it might have bits missing on another part. And I'd go through the process of trying to repair that and just give it to people that I knew that might be interested in having a free guitar. But there's no, that made me feel good about myself, I guess, but there's no kind of organized system for this yet. And I think that's a real gap. And in fact, on one of the trips for the book, and again, this is not in the book, but I don't think it is, or maybe we wrote it in. We were at a guitar industry summit, where all the guitar makers and manufacturers come together, and guitar repairers were there too. And I just heard a talk from a really prominent, well-regarded guitar repair expert. And after the talk, I went and approached him and said, it was a wonderful talk you gave. It's really inspiring to see all this care and expertise being used to repair guitars, but it's only the top end guitars that you're repairing. What about all those budget guitars that are in the world, that are on the side of the street, and that, there's good spruce in them, there's good rosewood in them. And he kind of looked at me blankly, as if to say, well, there's no money in it. There's not the market. There's no point in repairing those budget guitars. They'd never be worth enough to make it worthwhile in terms of the time you'd have to invest into repairing them. So I think it's a really significant challenge for the guitar industry, how it needs to manage that end of lifespan much better. There's some talk about recycling, that there may be ways to take recycled woods and remake them. So there you go. Claire's got the suggestion there. There is now a kind of a conversation around that, to take poorly made budget guitars of the past that are just actually unplayable, and see what can be salvaged out of those timbers and reused. So that's definitely a possibility. On Rock and Roll Stars, who smashed their guitars? Yeah, I don't know, but I do know that the Stratocaster that Jimi Hendrix set on fire at the Monterey. No, what festival was it? Someone here will probably know it and correct me if I'm wrong. So it isn't the Monterey Festival.
Mhm.
Anyway, it ended up in Dweezil Zappa's hands, Frank Zappa's son. And he went to great lengths to have it restored and to be returned back to playability. And it still has all the scorch marks all over the guitar. So perhaps it's possible to kind of reuse these smashed up guitars. And that's maybe a bit of an exception. But anyway, there's a good news story with that particular guitar.
Okay. Yeah, just to read what Claire had written here. Feels relevant to share the recycle project built by luthier Michi Matsuda, and she gives a link for that too. And it looks like we've got another question here from Donna. It seems that children who are interested in playing an instrument are started on piano or violin. Why not guitar?
Yeah, that is interesting. In fact, I would say that I've noticed that anecdotally among my kids and their peers, they've gone through.
And before you get started, I want to make sure that I circle back to Stephen's question too after this question.
Sure.
Yep.
It is an interesting phenomenon, I think. I do wonder whether there's something more physically accessible in both the piano and the violin. You know, guitars are bulky. They hurt your fingers when you start to play, particularly steel string acoustic guitars. I don't know. I have had, just through the friend group of my kids, there are particular, I can think of peers of theirs, particular ones that have picked up the guitar, and they've stuck with it actually. But it tends to be, I don't know, it was maybe the age I was at, like that 12, 13, 14, where you discover rock and roll, indie music, acoustic folk, female singer-songwriters. You discover particular styles of music that you just become really passionately attached to, and the guitar is central to that. Maybe there's something about the teenage experience there that makes it a little bit more likely to be where the guitar player picks up the instrument. It's interesting. I don't have an answer to that. I'm going to throw to Bill because Bill, being a guitar teacher, might have an insight there, in fact, on that.
Yeah, I can weigh in a little bit. I would say the guitar is more cumbersome pedagogically than piano or violin. It's not always straightforward, and we don't have it, and it is harder to play, which goes hand in hand with that. It's harder to play at first. The learning curve is challenging for small fingers. Violin is just, the large motor skills are all there for the violin. On the piano, you can reduce it as much as you want to. But with guitar, you can't really leave anything out technically just to make a sound. So that can be frustrating. And then also sort of like note reading and things like that. While you're doing that, it just makes it a really hard for kids to start. So but I do have to say, I think it's a lot more popular than you think for kids to be starting on guitar these days, even very young. But in terms of standardization for pedagogy, I don't know a lot of good ones. I think a teacher has to kind of be innovative and creative with small kids for guitar. I mean, there's classical guitar, and you can do it that very classical way, which basically when you say piano or violin, you mean classical piano and classical violin. They're not teaching kids Elton John on the piano when they come in there when they're 6 years old. They're teaching them Twinkle Little Star and everything like that. So there is that distinction because with guitar, there's classical guitar and then there's everything else, right? But with piano, they don't say this, but it is classical piano that you're coming in to learn. So I think that's really where the big difference is. There's that tradition of pedagogy in classical piano and classical violin, but there isn't as much of that in guitar. It is out there, definitely, but not on the mainstream.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Sure. So Stephen's question from before was, the book uses a follow the thing approach to understanding the global story of guitars. Was there anything you really wanted to follow but couldn't because of money, logistics, etc.?
Definitely. And it's testament to the the yeah, the kind of globalization of timber that's involved in guitar making that you know, we got invitations from Taylor to go to Cameroon to their ebony factory. But yeah, like just the logistics of getting to Cameroon. Actually, we nearly did. We knew another academic who had work, different project assisting universities in the way they were managed in Cameroon, and we were trying to tag along on that trip in a way that would have some funding around it. But yeah, money didn't get the funding in the end, so that one fell through. That would have been interesting. The challenge with that was that our trip to Cameroon would have been entirely dependent on Taylor, and they were very generous in extending the invitation to us to go to their Cameroon facility. But we knew that we would get the Taylor story of what they are doing in Cameroon, and it'd be, you know, a different order of field work again, to be based there over a much longer period. You know, there's language barriers and so forth, to dig a little deeper to see if there's another side to the story there that's not the story that Taylor guitars might themselves say. There's no reason to, you know, not believe what Taylor says necessarily about the way that they operate in Cameroon. They very much try to be transparent about it and to say that they offer good living wages and they have a more sustainable approach to ebony harvesting in Cameroon than what used to be the case. So they're certainly trying to do the right thing, but to be able to verify that on the ground is something that would have been really difficult for us logistically. So there was a money element there and a logistics element to not getting to ebony. There was an absolute classic couple of characters. Another one at the timber person at Taylor, and another the timber person at Martin had offered to take us to Honduras on their next mahogany buying trips. And it was a combination of funding and time, and it just sounded a bit daunting. Like it involved helicopters and yeah, modes of transport into remote locations that was just a bit beyond what I was prepared to accept. So that was a bit beyond our means, I guess, in the end. Yeah, it's not the be all and end all. I think we were disappointed that we couldn't go to Indonesia. Indonesia is quite close to Australia, so logistically we could get to Indonesia. A lot of lower end budget guitars are now made in Indonesia, so that would have been really good to chase up. And in the end, we just ran out of time, money, and yeah, and will probably. And I think we probably had a sense that we had enough of the story put together to complete the book. And to be honest, it was a struggle. I think the first version of the book was about 130,000 words, and that we were contracted for 95,000. So we had a real struggle to bring it down in length. And so had we visited Indonesia and explored that a little more, it would have very much bulged beyond the boundaries of what we already had in the book. We'd also visited China, so we had been to large, lower cost factories in China. So, and they're different countries, different contexts, but we had done research on and visited some of those more budget guitar companies in China. So we felt that we at least had some element of that story covered from those visits. But yeah, look, it's how long is a piece of string? I mean, if we'd had the research funding, perhaps we'd do more. But yeah, it's not a complete follow the thing, actually. It's partial.
Right. Okay, we are going to wrap it up, but just a few. These are the last questions I think we'll do here.
Yep.
We wrap it up here. May as well hit this one. Given your last name, any connection to Gibson guitars?
No, unrelated. Oh. Everybody asked that question. Yeah.
I've heard it's easier to learn guitar after getting the hang of playing music via piano. Want to weigh in on that?
You can, Bill.
Oh, sure. I think that can be. Yeah, that wouldn't hurt. That's the only way I'd say it. Yeah. Sometimes I will suggest that for kids because because all you got to do is press down the keys and make a sound. With guitar, it's a little bit more involved. But not necessarily so. There's nothing wrong with just jumping in. I'm starting with a 5-year-old myself next week. We'll see how that goes, he and his older brother. But I have a young student who started when he was 6, and he's doing quite well. He might almost be 8 o'clock or 8 years old right now. He's doing fantastically. He plays works by Radiohead, very sophisticated
Wow.
pieces of music. Mhm.
That's awesome.
So you can jump right in at a young age, I think, too. But it's great to play piano also. Okay, we'll make this the last question for today. This is a good kind of wrap up. You briefly mentioned how sustainability regulations on lumber have in turn increased the circulation of cheap lumber to maintain cash flow. The book also mentions how international regulations, i.e., CITES,
CITES.
sites, yep, vary in standards and can be incredibly harmful to nations that are dependent on lumber export, such as Madagascar. From this, we see that regulation alone does not achieve sustainable practices. How can we develop better practices of international material stewardship along with sustainability regulations?
Yeah, great question. I'll try and keep my
That's
answer.
from Ruben, by the way, from Ruben.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ruben. I'll try and keep my answer brief. Regulation is part of the story. It is part of the solution, I think, but it has to work hand in hand with more transparency from producers, from manufacturers, and ultimately a more educated consumer base. If guitarists themselves are more aware of where their guitars come from and the woods that they contain, all of those things together are what we need. I do have hope that that is actually the case, and that by and large there is the right set of intentions across those different spheres of both manufacturing, regulators, and consumers. But we'll see. Watch this space.
This guitar is from Madagascar right here. This is Madagascar rosewood on this classical guitar.
There you go.
I think that's it. All right. Thanks, everybody. We're going to wrap up, and thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed.